the father looked down at his son's lifeless body and couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't really know what to say. He stared down at his motionless boy, and although he knew his boy was ill and needed healing, this isn't what he expected. He searched his son's quiet, still face for as much as a blink of an eye, some indication that there was life. But he saw nothing. He looked at his son's scarred, peaceful face, his torn but still clothes, his son's hands that were disfigured from the burns. And he wanted to cry out, "What now? What else? I can't handle this." But his moment of desperation wrapped his lips up tightly, and he was silent in his moment of desperation. Have you been there before? In that moment of desperation where you have tried everything, but nothing works. And you want to cry out, but words can't express that hopeless situation. Have you been there? Where you will do anything to fix it, to heal them, to stop it, to rewind a couple days, a couple hours, a couple minutes. But you stand there in a moment of desperation and feel like you can't do anything. Maybe you're there today. Are you there? Do you feel like your life is spiraling out of control? Maybe you are. Maybe you've been there in the past. But sooner or later, we all face moments of despair. In fact, the Father wasn't always in a moment of despair. In fact, as he looked down at his son's lifeless body, his son's face finally looked peaceful. And it hadn't looked peaceful in a long time. His son's body looked like a sleeping infant, and it reminded the father way back all those years ago when he had held his boy for the very first time, having hopes and dreams for his young son. And he would hold his baby at night. He made sure his son didn't choke when he placed the first bit of solid food into his mouth. He encouraged his son's first words as his son began to babble by the fireside at night. He even taught his son holding hands, walking down the dirt road to avoid the roots and rocks and dips in the road so that his son wouldn't fall. And this father loved his son dearly. And he thought he had taught his son how to walk well until one night, as dinner was cooking and the sun was setting, he calls to his son, and his son comes running to him, but instead of running right to him, his son ran right into the fire where dinner was cooking, falling headlong into the flames. And the family rips off their cloaks, and they put their cloaks on the boy, and they smother the flames, protecting their sweet son from further injury. That night they put him to bed, and he has this terrible seizure with his eyes rolling back into his head, and his teeth are clenched. He's foaming at the mouth. His body is shaking violently, and they think it's a side effect of his severe burns. I imagine the father, although fatherhood seemed daunting, thought to himself, I think I can handle this. Stepping up and telling his family how to respond to their injured son. But the father, who at one time thought that he could handle it, I imagine soon realized that this was not a one-time occurrence. That his son, over the course of his life growing up, his son would fall into the fire often. His son would be driven into the water to be drowned. His son would fall on the ground, shaking in convulsions, grinding his teeth and foaming at the mouth. I imagine the father's problem grew over time as his son became larger and larger. A bigger boy to drag out of the fire, a heavier body to save. And the father realized he can't do it on his own. This problem has grown so much bigger than he could possibly imagine. And he started spiraling down into despair. You've been there before, haven't you? I can tell you've been there at that moment where you think, I can't do this. This tragedy, this problem, this issue, this crisis in my life, I can't do this. I can't handle this. The Bible tells us in Mark 9 that the reason this boy was having so many problems is that he was possessed by a demon. This story is straight out of Mark 9. If you have your Bibles, you can read along. If not, it'll be up on the screen. This father and his son. And the dad that knows that he can't do it hears of this group of disciples, this group of followers of Jesus that have been healing people. They've been doing God's work in the land, and miraculous stories are coming out of this group. And so he takes his son to the disciples when they enter into his village, and all of his friends around know who he is and who his son is, and he takes his boy to the disciples. And he takes his son and he says, you guys, will you please heal my son? And the disciples who have been healing people, the disciples who have been doing God's work, probably looked at each other and thought, sure we can. Demon, get out of that boy. But nothing happens. Someone else probably speaks up and says, demon, get out of that boy now. But nothing. The father, who knew that he couldn't handle it, at least thought maybe they could handle it. But they've let him down. Have you been there before? Putting your trust in someone or something else to solve your problem, but it lets you down. It doesn't fix your moment of despair. And so the disciples look at each other bewildered. Why they can't heal this demon-possessed boy. The crowd starts to argue. And Jesus comes down into the village. And that's where Mark 9, chapter 9, verse 14 picks up. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about?" And someone from the crowd said, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." Literally, they were not strong enough. They did not have the power to do this. They failed. Jesus turns, hearing this report, to the disciples and said, "You guys just don't get it, do you? You think you can do this? You don't trust God. You are faithless. You guys would figure by now, after all of this, that you would get this, but you don't." Jesus says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" And then he turns to the Father and says, "Bring him to me." Can you imagine what the Father must have thought? Yeah, right, bring him to me. Sure, why not? And your group couldn't do it, but I don't know if you can. I mean, can you really heal him? I'm begging for healing. I can do nothing. I can't do it. They can't do it. I don't even know if you can do it. God can do it. This man realizes he can't handle it, the disciples can't handle it, but his big question is, can God handle it? And that's the same question we wrestle with. Can God handle it? From your head, you've been in church a long time, in your head, answering the question, can God handle it? The head answer is what? Yes. The heart answer, if we are real with ourselves and we look at our attitudes, we look at our hearts, we look at our lives, when we really think about the things in our head, we say, yes, God can handle it. When we think about how we feel in our heart, we go, I don't really know if God can. I don't really feel like God can handle this. Yes, I know God can handle this, but I still worry. Yes, I know God is in control, but I still want to take control. Have you felt that disconnect between knowing it in your head and feeling it in your heart? The distance seems like a whole lot more than 18 inches. The Father says to Jesus, read with me in verse 20. And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? The father said, from childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. He says, if you can do anything, if it's possible, I don't even know at this point, Jesus, I've tried everything and nothing has worked. If you can do anything, fine, help me. I don't even know if you can do anything. And Jesus turns to the Father, and this is his response. I love his response. Jesus says, if you can. There's no if with God. There's no if with me. But the Father still hears it. Does he really believe it? Does he really trust it? Down to his core. He still wrestles with that question, can God handle it? We're going to talk about that question in our life groups this week. This question of, can I really believe God? Do I really trust God? In every area of my life, do we really trust that God is good? Do we really feel and trust that God is great and powerful? Do we really trust that God is glorious and worthy and heavy in our lives? Do we really trust that God is gracious and loves us no matter what? Do we really trust that in our heart, or do we just let it stay up in our head? And the Father was wrestling with this, right? Can you imagine Jesus looking at you and you said, Jesus, if you can help heal my boy, that'd be great. Please have mercy on me. And Jesus says, if? If you can? There's no if with God. He says, all things are possible for those who, what? Believe. Anything is possible for the one who believes. Now, what Jesus isn't saying here is that you can believe your way into whatever you want. I can't believe hard enough to heal my sister that has brain cancer. And the fact that my sister hasn't been healed from brain cancer doesn't necessarily believe because I'm not having enough faith. That misses the whole point of this. The whole point of Jesus asking him this isn't saying, well, do you have enough faith? Let me take out a measure, and I'm going to measure the amount of faith you have, and if it weighs enough, then I'm going to grant your wish. No. Jesus is saying, the issue isn't whether or not I can do this. The issue is, do you trust me in the fact that I can do this? And the Father cries out the most powerful prayer in this whole story. He has this most powerful prayer. As he looks at Jesus right in the eyes, he could say, yes, I believe, so do it. But he doesn't, because he's real and he understands it may be in his head, but it's not in his heart. You may have heard this before in verse 24. Immediately the father of the child cried out. He wants his son to be healed, and he says, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. I trust you to help me to trust you to do this. He's not even sure of his ability to continue on in belief that Jesus can do this. He says, yeah, I believe, I put my trust that you are powerful, but I don't even know if that'll continue. So I trust you to help me to trust you to do this. I am so convinced that I cannot handle this and that they can't handle it and only you can handle it, that even my faith in that needs to come from you in order to continue. I believe. Help my unbelief. You've been there before, haven't you? I know I have. Where I said, God, I know it in my head. I know this. But I don't feel it. God, I know that you are all powerful and you have everything under control, but I still want to micromanage my own life. God, I want to say that you're the co-pilot of my life when you should really be the pilot of everything and the big boss of my life. God, I know that, but I still think I can do a better job. God, I know you can restore my relationship, but I don't feel like it's possible. God, I know that you can bring healing and comfort, but right now I feel so broken and hurt. I can't move on. I believe. Help my unbelief. I trust you. Help me to trust you. The crowd hears this man's response, and I can imagine everybody leaning in. What's Jesus going to do? And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he's dead. The father there looking at his lifeless son. knew that he couldn't handle it. He knew that they couldn't handle it. He even knew that if at one time he believed that God could handle it, that God would have to continue to give him faith. He is stripped down to nothing. And he can't do anything. Have you been there before? Where just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, it gets a whole lot worse. And you are at the bottom of the pit and you are calling up to God saying, God, I don't know how much worse this can get. I can't do anything. I am completely broken. And then maybe you've been broken even more. To a level of pain that most people have no idea exists. And from that point of helplessness, you say, I've got nothing, God. I can't do anything. I cannot handle this. They can't handle this. Nobody can handle this. And I imagine as Mark is writing this story, he takes a breath and in firm pen strokes writes in big, bold, underlined letters the next two words that speak the truth of the gospel that we need to remind ourselves every single day. The next two words, but Jesus. But Jesus. The Father is there looking at his lifeless Son, but Jesus. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Only when things seemed completely gone. When everyone around, everyone realizes we can't do this. And the Father himself even says, I believe, but help my unbelief. I'm not even sure if I can continue the belief. It's all about you, God, and what you do. I'm putting all of my trust in you. Help me to continue to put all my trust in you. Then, Mark writes, but Jesus reaches down and picks the son back up, fully healed. And I found it fascinating. That's not the end of the story. That's not the end of this story. I think it would make a great ending to this story that the crowds were amazed and everybody trusted in Jesus. Everybody trusted that God can handle this. But that's not how the story ends. As if we wouldn't get the main idea from the story, we see the disciples, again, Jesus pulls them off into a side room. They have this sidebar, and they're sitting there talking to Jesus, and they go to Jesus and they go, Jesus, what was that all about? Why couldn't we do that? And Jesus said, because you didn't try hard enough. No, he didn't. Jesus says in verse 28, and when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we cast it out? And he said to them, this cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. You disciples, you didn't get it. Jesus says the only way that this works is because only God can handle this. When you pray, when you confess your dependence to God, you say, God, I can't handle this, they can't handle this, but you can handle this. Then things happen. But you guys just walked in going through the same techniques you had been using earlier, and you just tried to do things under your own power. This can only be driven out by prayer. And you know what prayer we've already read that's been powerful? The prayer that says, I believe, help my unbelief. The prayer that says, God, I've got nothing and you've got everything. I believe, help my unbelief. That's the cry of our heart. Is to help that information we know in our head move down into our heart and move out into our hands. That we know a lot about God. And if you've come here and it's your first time and you don't know a lot about God, this is a great place to start. But Jesus. Your life may be going terribly and you just came here because someone invited you, or I want to tell you, you are here on the right Sunday. God has you here for a reason, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you face, no matter what you've been through. But Jesus can take your hand and raise you up to a life that you never knew existed. It was so awesome and awe-inspiring. And if you've been in the church, if you've grown up in the church and you've heard all this stuff and you know it in your head and you've read this passage before, I want to remind you. I want to remind you that you can't handle it. I want to remind you that you can't handle it. But God can handle it. And you may be sitting there thinking, yeah, right. I mean, I know God can handle it, but you don't know the level of heartache that I'm facing. You don't know every day I wake up with the same burdens, and every night I'm kept up by the same heartache. You don't really know. God does. God knows exactly what you're going through. And the powerful prayer we see here is, God, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. God, I know it. Help me to trust it. We can't handle it, and God can. You may be sitting there right now, and this may be a good reminder, and you think, yeah, I'm going to tuck that in my back pocket. When I go through a tough time, I can pull it out and remember this truth to know and to trust. But you may be here today really wrestling through some serious stuff. I want to encourage you, there are groups of people right around you. If you were to turn and talk to people right around you to ask for prayer, say, I believe, but help my unbelief. They'll pray with you in a heartbeat. If that freaks you out a little bit too much, we have a prayer corner in the back of the service. And I know you may be stirred up wrestling with things. I want to encourage you, go back there for a confidential time. They won't tell anybody what you're saying. They'd love to pray for you. Not that anybody is better than anybody else, because we all struggle with that. I'm a believer, please help me believe. But I want to encourage you to go back after the service. I think it's fascinating, Jesus' response to the dad. When it comes to all of the failures in every other area. And Jesus rebukes the disciples and said, you guys don't get it. You guys are trusting in your own strength. You're not trusting that God can handle this. And he speaks 4 words to the Father that cut through the commotion of the crowd, that anchor him in his desperate time. Bring him to me. God, that is the cry of our heart. That we believe we need your help so that we can continue to trust you. God, I pray for each and every one of us. The heaviness, the burdens, the struggles that we're facing. God, that you would help us to give that up to you. You would help us to trust that you are good, that you are great. God, that we would be able to trust that you're glorious and that you're gracious. And God, help us not just to know it in our head, but to trust it with our heart. And we need help even doing that. We've got nothing apart from you. God, I pray that you would be so powerfully at work in our midst that we would be comfortable confessing doubt. We would be real with you and real with one another, God, so that we would see you at work. Our lives would remember that your story says that we're dead in our sin, but Jesus raises us up to a new life. God, we know in our head, help us feel it in our heart. Help us bring our problems and trust you with them. And all of God's people said together, amen.